It was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning on the Loose Women talk show. The studio was bright and busy as usual, with cameras ready and the famous purple and pink set looking perfect under the lights. 4 women sat around the table, preparing for another episode of the popular daytime program. Denise Welch sat adjusting her microphone, and anyone who watched the show regularly could see she seemed tense. Next to her was Ruth Langford, an experienced host who was looking through her notes. Colleen Nolan sat in the third seat with a friendly smile, though she could sense something wasn't quite right. At the end of the table, Janet Street Porter tapped her red fingernails on the desk, watching everything with sharp eyes. The special guest that day was Sean Bean, the famous actor from Yorkshire whose rough accent and powerful performances had made him a star around the world. He was known for playing characters who died dramatic deaths, like Boromir in Lord of the Rings and Ned Stark in Game of Thrones. But that morning, he had no idea he was about to face the most difficult interview of his entire career. Sean Bean sat down in the guest chair looking comfortable and confident. He had done hundreds of interviews before, so this should have been easy. He wore a simple black jacket over a gray shirt and looked distinguished and professional. His weathered face showed the combination of toughness and gentleness that his fans loved. Ruth started the interview in her usual warm way, welcoming him enthusiastically. At first, everything went smoothly as Bean talked about his newest project, another crime drama where his character would meet a tragic end. Colleen laughed and leaned forward, asking him if he ever got tired of playing characters who always died on screen. Bean chuckled and said he supposed he had made a whole career out of it. He joked that there was something freeing about playing characters who weren't afraid to face their fate. The audience laughed along with him, clearly enjoying his humble sense of humor. Even Janet, who was known for making sharp comments, seemed genuinely entertained by how easygoing he was. But Denise had been strangely quiet. Her fingers drummed on the desk in a pattern that was getting more and more agitated. The other women on the show were used to her occasional mood changes, but this felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, like the feeling right before a storm hits. Ruth continued the conversation, asking Bean about his upcoming work and how he balanced his busy career with family life. It was a simple, friendly question that guests usually liked answering. Bean smiled and started talking about how important it was to spend time at home between filming jobs. He said that family meant everything to him, and after all his years working in entertainment, he had realized that the relationships you build away from the camera are what really matter in life. The studio audience made sounds of approval, clearly touched by how sincere he sounded. Ruth nodded encouragingly, Colleen smiled warmly, and even Janet looked impressed by his honest answer. But Denise's face had become dark and angry. Her lips pressed together in a tight line, and her eyes narrowed as she watched Bean talk. The other hosts started to notice her changing mood and gave each other worried looks. Then suddenly, Denise interrupted him. Her voice cut through his words like a knife, and the sharp edge in her tone immediately changed the whole atmosphere in the studio. She said that his words were very touching, but they should talk about what really mattered. Bean looked genuinely confused by her sudden hostility. He said he was sorry, not understanding what was wrong. Denise snapped at him not to play innocent wit. Her. She leaned forward aggressively and said he was coming on the show talking about family and relationships, but what about his responsibilities to his fans? What about the promises he made? Bean's confusion deepened. He had no idea what she was talking about. Ruth tried to step in, sensing the conversation was taking a dangerous turn, but Denise cut her off sharply. Denise said she was tired of celebrities coming on the show and feeding them rehearsed lines while ignoring the people who made them famous. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Camera operators looked at each other worriedly, while the production team tried to figure out what was happening. Bean sat perfectly still. His many years of professional experience helped him stay calm despite this unexpected attack. Bean said carefully that he wasn't sure what she was referring to. His voice remained calm and measured. If he had done something to upset her, perhaps she could explain what she meant. But his reasonable response only made Denise angrier. Her face turned red and her voice got louder, making everyone in the studio uncomfortable. She said that actors like him thought they could just show up, smile, and expect everyone to admire them, but some people could see right through it. Colleen looked horrified by what her colleague was doing. She said this was completely inappropriate, and that Sean was their guest who deserved to be treated with respect. But Denise laughed bitterly and asked about respecting the audience. What about respecting the people who watched every day expecting honest conversation instead of rehearsed publicity talk? Bean's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed steady. He said he had come there in good faith, ready to have an honest conversation about his work and life. He wasn't sure what had triggered this reaction, but he promised that everything he had said was completely genuine. Janet, who never backed down from controversy, tried to lighten the mood with humor. She said this was certainly more exciting than their usual Tuesday morning chat about the weather. But Denise was beyond being calmed down. She turned on Janet with the same anger, saying this wasn't a joke. She said it was about integrity and holding these people accountable for their actions. Ruth demanded to know what actions she was talking about. She said Sean had done nothing but answer their questions politely and professionally, and this behavior was absolutely unacceptable. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure if they were watching real drama or some kind of setup. But the raw emotion in Denise's voice and the obvious discomfort of everyone else made it clear this was very real. Bean finally showed the first signs of losing his patience. His Yorkshire accent became stronger as his voice took on a harder edge. He said he didn't know what her problem was, but he wouldn't sit there and be insulted for no reason. He had come there as a favor to the show, not to be ambushed by someone with a grudge to settle. Denise shrieked that he thought he was doing them a favor by being there. She said his arrogance was absolutely shocking. Colleen stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She said that was enough and this had gone way too far. She apologized to Sean on behalf of the show, saying this was not how they treated their guests. But Denise wasn't finished. She also stood up, pointing an accusing finger at Bean. She told Colleen not to apologize for her. She said someone needed to call out this entitled behavior, and these celebrities thought they could just walk in and expect everyone to bow down to them. Bean's composure finally broke completely. He stood up slowly, and his full height looked imposing under the bright studio lights. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect on movie sets around the world. He said that was quite enough of this nonsense. He didn't know what had gotten into her, but he wouldn't be spoken to like this by anyone. He had been nothing but polite and professional since he walked through that door. The studio erupted into chaos as Denise's rage reached its peak. What came out of her mouth next would be shared on social media for weeks. Her face twisted with fury as she jabbed her finger toward Bean with vicious intent. She screamed that he called it professional to show up unprepared, giving them the same tired answers he had been using for 20 years. Did he think they were idiots who couldn't see through his act? Bean's eyes flashed dangerously. The same intensity that had made him legendary on screen was now focused entirely on the woman attacking him without reason. He asked what act she meant. He had come there to talk about his work, his family, and the things that mattered to him. If that wasn't good enough for her, then maybe she should find a different job. The studio gasped collectively. Ruth's mouth fell open in shock while Colleen covered her face with her hands, unable to watch what was unfolding. Janet sat frozen, her usual quick wit abandoning her in the face of such unprecedented chaos. Denise's laugh was sharp and bitter. She said she had been doing this job longer than he had been pretending to be an actor. She had interviewed real stars, people with actual talent, not washed-up has-beens trading on past glory. The insult hit its mark. Bean's face darkened, and for a moment the studio held its breath. Here was a man who had faced down monsters on screen, who had played kings and warriors with unwavering strength. But nothing had prepared him for this kind of unprovoked personal attack. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. He said he had forgotten more about acting than she would ever know about presenting. At least when he did his job, he didn't spend his time tearing down innocent people for cheap entertainment. Ruth finally found her voice, though it shook with emotion. She told Denise to stop right now. She was embarrassing herself and the show. Sean had done nothing to deserve this treatment. But Denise whirled on Ruth with equal fury, telling her not to dare tell her how to do her job. Just because Ruth was content to sit there asking easy questions didn't mean everyone else had to play along with this fake show. Ruth's professional mask slipped completely. She said the only fake thing there was Denise pretending to be a journalist while behaving like a playground bully. The audience began to whisper among themselves, their discomfort growing by the second. Some people started to get up from their seats, clearly wanting to escape the toxic atmosphere that had taken over the studio. Colleen made one last desperate attempt to restore order. She begged everyone to take a moment to calm down. They were on live television and needed to think about what message they were sending to their viewers. Denise spat that the message was honesty. The message was that some of them wouldn't be bought and paid for by celebrity handlers and publicity machines. Bean had heard enough. His Yorkshire temper, usually kept carefully under control, finally boiled over completely. He said nobody had bought him anything. He had agreed to come on the show because he thought it might be a pleasant way to spend a morning. He was a fool for thinking he would be treated with basic human decency. Denise's voice reached a new level of hysteria. She asked about the decency he showed to his fans when he gave lazy performances. What about the decency he showed to audiences who paid good money to watch him sleepwalk through another role? Bean's voice rose to match hers now, all politeness abandoned. He said he had spent 40 years perfecting his craft, working with some of the finest directors and actors in the world. He didn't need career advice from someone whose biggest achievement was stirring up controversy on daytime television. Janet finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. She suggested they should go to a commercial break, but Denise snapped that there would be no commercial break. She wanted to finish this conversation right there and then. She wanted to talk about how he had been coasting on his Lord of the Rings fame for decades. Bean's face turned purple with rage. He said he had made over 60 films and television shows. He had worked constantly for 4 decades, taking on challenging roles that other actors wouldn't touch. If that was coasting, then what did she call sitting behind a desk asking other people about their lives? The personal nature of the attacks was getting worse by the second. Ruth looked desperately toward the production booth, silently begging for someone to stop this. The camera operators kept filming, unsure whether they should stop or capture every moment of this unprecedented meltdown. Denise shot back that she called it holding celebrities accountable. She called it asking the hard questions that his usual interviewers were too scared to ask. Bean laughed harshly. He said she hadn't asked him a single question about his work, his process, or anything remotely professional. She had done nothing but throw personal insults like a child having a tantrum. Colleen was openly crying now, her makeup running down her cheeks as she watched her colleague destroy her own career in real time. She begged Denise to stop, saying she was better than this, and this wasn't who she was. Denise declared proudly that this was exactly who she was. She was someone who wouldn't be intimidated by entitled celebrities who, too, thought their fame made them untouchable. Bean shook his head in disbelief. He said he had been sitting there taking her abuse for 10 minutes without fighting back. He had answered every question she had bothered to ask between insults. If anyone was acting entitled, it was the woman who thought she had the right to attack people for no reason. Denise's voice cracked again as she said there was a reason. The reason was that she was sick of fake people giving fake answers to fake questions. She was sick of the whole rotten system. Ruth had heard enough. She stood up with the dignity that had made her a respected broadcaster for decades and looked directly into the camera. She apologized to the viewers and to their guest for what they were witnessing. She said this was not representative of the standards they maintained on the show. Denise screamed at her not to apologize for her. She said she was the only one there with the courage to tell the truth. Bean's voice dripped with contempt as he asked about truth. He said the truth was that she had lost her mind. The truth was that she was having some kind of breakdown on national television and taking it out on an innocent person. The words hit Denise like a physical blow. For a moment, her face crumpled and the mask of righteous anger slipped to reveal something far more vulnerable underneath. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by even fiercer determination. She whispered that she would show him a breakdown. The studio fell silent, everyone sensing that whatever was about to happen would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Bean stood perfectly still, his hands clenched at his sides, waiting for the next attack. When Denise spoke again, her voice was quiet but filled with such poison that everyone in the studio could feel it. She told him to get out. The 2 words hung in the air like a death sentence. Bean's imbécile. Eyebrows shot up in surprise while the other presenters looked at each other in horror. Bean said slowly that he begged her pardon. She repeated that he heard her correctly. Get out of her studio. Get out of her show. Get out of her sight. Ruth gasped audibly and said Denise couldn't do that. She didn't have the authority. But Denise cut her off sharply, saying she had every authority. This was her show, and she wanted him gone now. The studio erupted into complete chaos as the final confrontation reached its explosive peak. Bean stared at Denise for a long moment, his face showing disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like pity. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute finality. He repeated her words about it being her studio. He looked around at the chaos, taking in Ruth's horrified expression, Colleen's tears, and Janet's shocked silence. Her show? Last he checked, this was supposed to be a team effort. Denise told him not to lecture her about teamwork, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had done. She just told him to leave. But Bean wasn't finished. He took a step closer to the panel desk, his presence commanding despite the circus atmosphere around them. He said the real tragedy was that she had a chance to have an interesting conversation with someone who had spent his entire life telling stories. Instead, she chose to create a spectacle. Ruth found her voice again, though it trembled with emotion. She asked Sean not to judge all of them by this behavior. This was not who they were as a show. Bean nodded toward Ruth with genuine respect, saying he knew that. She had been nothing but professional, and he appreciated it. His gaze shifted to Colleen, who was still wiping her eyes. He told her this wasn't her fault either. Even Janet received a small nod of acknowledgement. He told her that at least she had tried to lighten the mood when things got ugly. The kindness in his voice toward the other hosts, I made Denise's behavior look worse by comparison. She stood there isolated in her fury, watching as Bean demonstrated the exact grace and professionalism she had accused him of lacking. She said how touching it was, a little farewell speech for his adoring fans, but the bite had gone out of her words. Bean turned to look at her directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, just a deep sadness. He said he actually felt sorry for her. Whatever was eating her up inside, whatever was making her lash out at people who had done nothing wrong, he hoped she would find a way to deal with it that didn't involve hurting innocent people. The unexpected compassion in his words seemed to deflate Denise completely. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked uncertain. She mumbled that she didn't need his pity, but the fight had gone out of her voice. Bean said quietly that it wasn't pity. It was concern for a fellow human being who was clearly struggling with something, but he wouldn't stand there and be her punching bag while she worked through it. He began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and dignified. The small action somehow carried more power than all the shouting that had come before it. Ruth made one final attempt to save the situation, but Bean interrupted her gently. He said Denise had made her feelings perfectly clear, and he wasn't going to subject himself or the ladies to any more of this. Some battles weren't worth fighting. As he unclipped the microphone from his belt, the studio fell into an eerie silence. The audience sat transfixed, watching a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Even the camera operator seemed reluctant to move. Colleen wiped her eyes one final time and looked up at Bean with admiration. She said she wanted him to know that not all of them felt this way. He had been nothing but gracious through all of this. Bean smiled at her, the first genuine smile he had managed since the confrontation began. He thanked her and said it meant more than she knew. He placed his microphone on the guest chair and straightened his jacket with the same care he might have taken before stepping onto a movie set. The simple gesture somehow restored order to the chaos around him. He addressed the stunned audience directly, apologizing that their morning entertainment had turned into something unpleasant. That was never his intention, and he was sure it wasn't theirs either. A few members of the audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into sustained appreciation for his handling of an impossible situation. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the studio in its grip. Denise watched the applause with growing horror, finally understanding what she had done. The audience wasn't clapping for her righteous stand against celebrity entitlement. They were showing their support for the man she had attacked without cause. She said weakly that this was ridiculous, but nobody was listening to her anymore. Bean walked toward the studio exit with unhurried steps, nodding politely to crew members as he passed. At the door, he paused and looked back one final time. He told Ruth, Colleen, and Janet that it was a pleasure meeting them, even under these circumstances. He hoped the rest of their show would go more smoothly. He didn't look at Denise at all. As the studio door closed behind him with a soft click, the silence that followed was deafening. Ruth stared at the door, then at her notes, then at the camera that was still rolling. She said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, that this was certainly unexpected. Colleen had stopped crying but looked shell-shocked. She said she couldn't believe what had just happened. In 30 years of television, she had never seen anything like that. Janet, for once in her life, seemed completely at a loss for words. She opened her mouth several times, but nothing came out. And Denise sank into her chair like a deflated balloon, the full weight of her actions finally hitting her. The righteous anger that had fueled her outburst was gone, replaced by a growing awareness of the professional disaster she had just committed on live television. Ruth, drawing on decades of broadcasting experience, tried to restore some sense of normalcy to the show. She told the audience they would take a short break, and when they returned, they would discuss the day's entertainment news with their correspondent. But as the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, everyone knew there would be no returning to normal after what they had just witnessed. The remaining 3 presenters sat in stunned silence while crew members whispered among themselves about what they had just captured on tape. Denise stared at the empty guest chair where Sean Bean had been sitting just minutes before, the microphone he had placed there serving as a stark reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. In the space of less than 15 minutes, a routine celebrity interview had transformed into one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. And somewhere outside the studio, a legendary actor walked away with his dignity intact, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal demons loose in the harsh light of live television. The storm was over, but the aftermath was just beginning.